My name is Elowen Vance. I'm 32, and last Thursday, I walked into a suffocatingly expensive boardroom full of people who had spent the last 14 years pretending I was dead. I walked out, owning their futures. At my grandfather's will reading, the Vance family carved up a fortune. My father, Julian, inherited the primary estate. My brother, Silas, walked away with controlling shares of the tech firm. And I was handed a fragile, wax-sealed envelope containing nothing but a phone number written on hotel stationery. Silas actually choked on his sparkling water laughing. He wiped his mouth, adjusted his bespoke tie, and sneered that it was probably a charity hotline for my grubby little lifestyle. So I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I pulled my phone from my denim jacket, dialed the digits, and slammed it onto speakerphone right in the center of that polished mahogany table. A man's voice answered. He stated my name, a title that now belonged to me, and a dollar amount that made every single drop of blood drain from my father's face. But before I get to the look of sheer panic in their eyes, let me rewind to the morning the earth tilted. The day my grandfather, Arthur Vance, died. The call came at 4 in the morning. I was already awake in my workshop, the smell of burnt metal and welding gas heavy in the air, grinding down a steel beam for a restored bridge project. The phone vibrated against the workbench. Unknown caller. I usually ignore those, but something in the stillness of the room made me reach for it. Elowen, it's Aunt Clara. Her voice was a fragile whisper. Arthur passed away at midnight. The reading is Wednesday at Sterling and Croft. She hesitated, the silence stretching. Your father explicitly forbade them from putting you on the security list, but you deserve to know. I hung up and stared at the sparks dying on the concrete floor.
I stared at the only picture I kept in the shop. Me at 17, covered in sawdust, laughing beside Arthur as we built a wooden dinghy in his secret shed. My father, Julian Vance, the ruthless CEO of Vance Analytics, publicly disowned me the day I turned 18. He did it at a massive corporate gala, raising a glass of champagne and declaring his only heir was Silas. My unforgivable sin? I refused to study corporate finance. I wanted to build things with my hands. I wanted to travel to disaster zones and reinforce crumbling foundations. So I packed my bags and joined a global relief crew. The very next morning, Julian systematically erased my existence from the family archives. Silas enthusiastically played the role of gatekeeper, controlling grandfather's schedule, and telling everyone the old man was too ashamed to see me. It was a massive, calculated lie. Arthur and I had a secret. He wrote to me constantly, dozens of letters smuggled through a P.O. box over 14 years. When I finally settled back in the city, we met once a month at a decaying, overgrown greenhouse cafe on the outskirts of town. Nobody in the family had a clue. 4 months before he died, we sat at our usual rusted iron table, surrounded by wilting ferns. Arthur looked so frail, his skin like translucent parchment, but his dark eyes missed absolutely nothing. He watched me trace a crack in my coffee mug. "Still fixing broken things, El?" he asked quietly. "Always," I replied. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I drove home that afternoon with a strange pit in my stomach. When I looked in the rearview mirror, Arthur was standing by the greenhouse entrance, leaning heavily on his cane, looking impossibly small against the sprawling ivy. He never brought up Elias again, and I never pushed it. I really should have pushed it. Fast forward to Wednesday. The offices of Sterling and Croft occupied the top floor of a glass monolith downtown. It was the kind of law firm that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and absolute ruthlessness. I parked my battered, mud-splattered Jeep Wrangler right between Silas's pristine Porsche and my father's sleek black Audi. My truck had a massive scratch down the side from hauling timber last week.
It stuck out like a sore thumb in a sea of luxury, and I didn't care at all. I marched inside wearing steel-toed boots, heavy work jeans, and a faded flannel shirt. No designer dress, no pearls to clutch. The lobby receptionist blinked rapidly at her glowing monitor. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't have you on the visitor log." "Elowen Vance," I said, leaning over her immaculate counter. "Arthur's granddaughter. I don't need an invitation to my own family's funeral arrangements." She nervously picked up her phone, whispered frantically, and eventually buzzed me through the heavy glass security doors. I shoved the heavy oak doors of the conference room wide open without knocking. 10 heads whipped around. Julian sat at the head of the long table, his hands steepled. His jaw clamped tight the second he saw my boots. Silas, slouched next to him, gave me the kind of mocking, pitying smile you reserve for a stray cat. Miriam, my father's much younger second wife, nervously touched her diamond necklace. "Who let you up here?" Julian demanded. It wasn't a question, it was a threat. "Gravity," I replied dryly, pulling out the only empty leather chair. "Arthur was my grandfather. Try and throw me out." The estate attorney, a sharply dressed man named Croft, nervously cleared his throat. He glanced from Julian's furious glare to my muddy boots. "Miss Vance is explicitly named in the documents. She is legally permitted to be present." Julian didn't say a word, but the veins in his neck bulged. "Fine," he hissed. "Get this over with." I crossed my arms and sank into the chair. Croft began to read in that monotonous, drone-like cadence of a man who dealt entirely in dead people's money. Julian received the sprawling countryside manor and a clean $2 million in liquid assets. He gave a sharp, entitled nod. Silas was awarded the remaining 51% of Vance Analytics, plus a hefty investment portfolio. The idiot was actually texting on his phone while Croft read his inheritance. Miriam got the summer house in Aspen and $500,000. She performed a rehearsed sniffle into a silk handkerchief. Even my distant, bratty cousins got hefty trust funds. Nobody gasped. Nobody argued. It was exactly the corporate carving they had all anticipated. Then Croft slowly flipped to the final, heavy parchment page. And to Elowen Maeve Vance. Every single eye in the room zeroed in on me. Croft pulled a small, ancient-looking envelope from a secondary folder. A sealed document, mandated to be handed directly to the beneficiary. He slid it across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. The paper was rough, the edges frayed. My name was scrawled in Arthur's unmistakable, shaky cursive. I tore the wax seal. Inside was a single blank index card. Written in the dead center was a 10-digit phone number and one brief sentence. "Call Elias. He holds your leverage. AV." There was no bank account, no property deed, nothing. Silas leaned over, squinting at the card, and burst into a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter. "A phone number?" Silas wheezed, looking around the room to make sure everyone was enjoying his comedy routine. "Is this a joke? Must be the local homeless shelter hotline. Fits the aesthetic." He gestured vaguely at my flannel. Julian didn't laugh, but a cold, satisfied smirk played on his lips. He finally looked away from me, dismissing my entire existence. Miriam whispered something about it being a fitting gesture. Aunt Clara, sitting quietly in the corner, just watched me with sad, knowing eyes. Croft shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Miss Vance, that envelope is external to the primary probate estate. I have no record of its contents." External to the estate. The words clicked in my head like a loaded chamber. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out like they desperately wanted me to. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my battered smartphone, and laid it flat on the expensive table. I punched in the numbers. Silas stopped laughing. "What exactly are you doing?" "Calling the shelter," I said, not looking up. Let's see if they have a bed open for me tonight. I hit the speaker button and cranked the volume to max. The dialing tone echoed off the glass walls. 1 ring. 2 rings. Julian dropped his pen. Miriam's fake crying stopped instantly. On the 3rd ring, the line clicked open. A deep, sharp voice echoed through the room. Elowen, I am Elias Thorne. Arthur warned me you'd be calling today. The entire room seemingly stopped breathing. The hum of the air conditioner felt deafening. Elias didn't miss a beat. I am the executor of Vanguard Capital Trust, a private holding entity your grandfather established 14 years ago. You are the sole, uncontested beneficiary and managing director. Current liquid and asset valuation is exactly $58.2 million.
The silence that followed was absolute. The massive number just hung there in the sterile air, suffocating them. Silas dropped his phone. It clattered loudly against the mahogany, but he didn't even flinch. His smug face drained of all color, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. Julian gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned violently white, staring at my cheap cell phone like it was an active explosive device. Miriam's jaw literally dropped. Even the lawyer, Croft, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes in sheer disbelief. "Thank you, Elias," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm, exactly like I did when stabilizing a collapsing roof under pressure. "I'll be at your office first thing tomorrow." I tapped the screen to end the call, picked up my phone, and finally looked around the room. Every person who had mocked me, erased me, and treated me like dirt on their expensive shoes was staring at me in absolute paralyzing horror. "So," I said, leaning forward and resting my chin on my hands, "does anyone else want to make a joke about my aesthetic?" Nothing. Absolute silence. Julian was the first to break. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. When he spoke, his voice cracked, a sound I had never, ever heard from him before. What is this?" he stammered, the authoritative CEO completely gone, replaced by a panicked old man. This is where I have to pause, because this exact second, this was the moment I had survived 14 years of exile for. It was never about the money. It was about watching their arrogant world shatter. Silas suddenly erupted, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is illegal. He can't hide assets in a shadow trust. Everything he owned belongs to this firm."
The midday sun was baking the concrete outside the Sterling and Croft building. I was just shoving the key into my Jeep's door when Julian materialized behind me, with Silas hovering over his shoulder like a nervous shadow. Julian slapped his palm flat against my window, physically blocking me from opening the door. We were standing face to face for the first time in 14 years, without a piece of furniture between us. He looked older. The silver hair had thinned, the sharp jawline had softened into jowls, but his eyes were exactly the same. They held the arrogant certainty of a man who believed the world owed him its obedience. "You are not extracting a single cent from this family," he growled. "My father was utterly delusional at the end, and you took advantage of a dying man." I didn't blink. I just stared right back into that familiar glare. "You're the one who banned your own daughter from seeing her grandfather. You're the one who stood up in front of 100 corporate investors and declared I was dead to you because I refused to sit in a cubicle. You did that. Nobody else." Julian actually pulled his hand back from the glass. He didn't retreat, but the words hit him harder than he anticipated. That's when Silas stepped in, throwing up his manicured hands in a gesture of fake diplomacy. "Look, Elowen, if this trust fund thing is actually real, we handle it internally. We keep the lawyers out of it. We sit down like a family and figure out a fair distribution." I looked at my older brother. The bespoke suit, the expensive haircut. The soft hands that had never built a single thing in their life. You don't want external lawyers because you're terrified of what they might uncover, I said. Silas flinched. It was a micro-expression, a tiny twitch of the eyelid. But I saw it. It was the exact same flinch I used to see in rookies right before a mortar shell dropped. I yanked the door open, climbed in, and started the engine. I left them standing in the exhaust fumes and drove straight back to my apartment. It's a cramped 600-square-foot walk-up in the industrial district. Exposed brick, thrifted furniture, everything meticulously organized out of ingrained military habit. I don't keep clutter. The only thing I hide is an olive drab ammunition tin shoved to the very back of my closet. Inside that dented metal box are 62 handwritten letters. Every single one is from Arthur. The first one arrived at my barracks during basic training, written in his blocky architect's handwriting. Elowen, your father is a stubborn fool. I am endlessly proud of you. I will write every month. AV. And he kept his word. Through boot camp, through my engineering certifications, through back-to-back deployments in disaster zones, and long nights repairing collapsed infrastructure overseas. He sent letters detailing the weather, the bad coffee at our secret greenhouse cafe, and the early days of building his fortune from absolutely nothing. I sat on my faded rug and pulled out the very last envelope. He mailed it just 8 weeks before his heart finally gave out. The ink was smudged, the handwriting shaky and frail. Elle, my time is running short. I need you to know I built a fortress for you. Elias has the keys. Trust him implicitly. You are the only person in this bloodline who never asked me for a dime and still showed up just to drink bad coffee with an old man. You get what I made because you're the only one who knows the value of calloused hands. I pressed the fragile paper against my chest. My hands started to tremble, and it wasn't from leftover adrenaline or anger. It was 14 years of missing the only parent who actually loved me, condensing into a single crushing weight. I finally broke down and cried, right there on the floor. When the tears stopped, I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve, picked up my phone, and texted Elias Thorne. Tomorrow morning. Show me everything. Elias Thorne didn't work out of a skyscraper. His office was a retrofitted shipping container sitting on a dusty gravel lot near the shipyards. No secretary, no espresso machine. Just a battered steel desk, heavy filing cabinets, and a framed photograph on the corrugated wall. It was a picture from the late 80s. Elias and Arthur, both covered in grease and cement dust, laughing in front of a half-built commercial plaza. Elias was in his late 60s, built like a cinder block, with hands as tough as cured leather. He had been Arthur's chief operations manager for 3 decades before Julian forcibly bought him out of Vance Analytics. Arthur established Vanguard Capital Trust back in 2012, Elias explained, spreading thick stacks of legal documents across his desk. He funded it entirely with his own private capital, early real estate flips, independent land grabs, offshore investments. He never touched a single penny of the company's money, completely walled off. He slid a thick bound operating agreement toward me. Look at Section 4. My name was right there. Elowen Vance, sole managing director. When Arthur passed, total operational control transferred to you instantaneously, Elias said. No probate courts, no judges. This is a private corporate succession, not a last will and testament. Julian could easily tie up a will in litigation for a decade. He cannot touch a private corporate entity he has zero legal ties to. Arthur saw them coming. I scanned the asset ledgers. Commercial high-rises, hundreds of acres of undeveloped suburban land, aggressive tech portfolios. Total liquid and hard asset valuation, $58.2 million. I had to remind myself to breathe. Elias watched me for a moment, then opened his bottom desk drawer. He pulled out a generic, unmarked black flash drive and placed it deliberately over the contract. Arthur made me swear to keep this locked up. He said if Silas ever tried to burn you, this is the fire extinguisher. I have no idea what's on it. He just said you'd know exactly how to use it.
I took the drive home, locked my deadbolt, and plugged it into my laptop. A single folder popped up on the screen. The label simply read, Silas. I double-clicked. Inside were 3 years of heavily redacted expense reports, vendor payouts, and travel logs from Vance Analytics. Arthur had meticulously highlighted dozens of discrepancies. He flagged corporate retreats that never happened, luxury travel expenses for non-existent clients, and massive monthly invoices paid out to shell consulting firms that didn't show up on any state tax registry. It didn't take a forensic accountant to do the math. Over the past 36 months, Silas had systematically embezzled nearly $400,000 from his own father's company. Attached to the bottom of the ledger was a scanned, handwritten note from Arthur. I caught Silas stealing 2 years ago. I kept my mouth shut because Julian would blindly protect him and bury the evidence. If Silas tries to block your inheritance, drop this on the table. Do not use it for revenge. Use it for leverage. Arthur had literally handed me a loaded gun. My phone vibrated against the table. Silas's name flashed on the screen. I answered in silence. I just retained a massive litigation team, Silas snapped. His voice was too tight, clearly reading from a rehearsed script. We are challenging the trust. Arthur was 82. He had a documented history of cognitive decline. We're having the entire entity voided by a federal judge. He was 68 when he formed it, Silas, I replied calmly. Sharp enough to build a $50 million fortress right under your nose. Be incredibly careful about what you choose to dig up, because I own a shovel too. I hung up before he could respond. An hour later, Aunt Clara called from a burner phone. The family was holding an emergency war council at Julian's mansion. They were pooling $100,000 to hire a shark law firm. Their strategy? Claim I had brainwashed a frail old man during our secret meetings. Silas is running his mouth, telling the entire extended family that you're just a glorified construction worker who will immediately fold under corporate legal pressure, Clara whispered over the phone. I almost laughed out loud. I had negotiated supply drops with warlords while under active sniper fire. A boy in a tailored suit threatening me with paperwork was laughable. Thanks, Clara. I'll handle it, I said, immediately pulling out the contact card Arthur had left me for a corporate attorney named Evelyn Cross. I walked into Evelyn's downtown office the next morning. She was a ruthless, 50-something partner who didn't waste time on pleasantries. Arthur prepaid my retainer 3 years ago, she said, scanning the trust documents. This is completely bulletproof. The successor clause is legally airtight. They're going to claim diminished capacity, I told her. Evelyn practically smirked. She pulled 2 thick medical files from her cabinet. Arthur anticipated that. He submitted to 2 grueling, independent neuropsychological evaluations in 2012 and 2022, both conducted by board-certified specialists with 0 ties to this firm. He passed flawlessly. If your brother brings a capacity argument to a judge, I will annihilate it in the preliminary hearing. I handed her the flash drive with the embezzlement records. She reviewed the spreadsheets in absolute silence for 5 minutes. This is felony wire fraud, she finally said. If he sues, we countersue and destroy him. I want to settle this at Arthur's house on Saturday, face to face. Later that night, Silas called again. His aggressive tone had vanished, replaced by the slick, desperate voice he used on hesitant clients. Look, Elle, we're blood. Let's not enrich the lawyers. We split the trust assets right down the middle. 50-50. Everybody wins. You want to talk about fairness? I shot back. You blocked my number from Arthur's phone. You told him I didn't care anymore. You can't prove that, he shouted. I don't need to, I replied. Your position is weak, Silas. Try harder. And I hung up. Friday night, I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing property deeds, when a heavy knock rattled my door. I checked the peephole. Julian was standing in the hallway, alone.
I unlocked the deadbolt, and he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. The lifelong habit of a man who owned every room he entered. His eyes swept over my tiny apartment in disgust, lingering on the thrifted chairs and the single-framed photo of Arthur on the wall. My father was incredibly vulnerable, Julian said, his voice dropping into a harsh register. He was 73 when he signed those papers. He had no idea what he was doing. He was 73 and actively hiding $58 million from you, I corrected him. That isn't vulnerability, Julian. That's a surgical strike. Julian took a step closer, towering over the table. You walked away from this family. You chose to sleep in mud and play with hammers instead of contributing to the empire I built. I walked away because you demanded absolute obedience, and when I refused, you erased me like a typo, I said, not breaking eye contact. He fell silent. For a brief second, he looked entirely out of his depth. He turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him. The next morning, Clara sent me a screenshot of the Vance family group chat. Silas had officially filed the legal challenge. His message was completely unhinged, accusing me of elder abuse and manipulation. Miriam chimed in, saying Arthur would be devastated by my greed. I stared at the phone. I didn't feel angry. I felt the cold, familiar clarity of a combat drop. When the noise finally fades, all you see is the next tactical maneuver. I picked up my phone and called Evelyn Cross. Bring the medical evaluations and the flash drive to Arthur's estate this afternoon. If Silas decides to cross the line, I'm burning his life to the ground.
Are you absolutely positive you want to do this alone? Evelyn asked over the phone, the skepticism thick in her voice. I've cleared out collapsed tunnels with aftershocks still rolling, I told her, throwing my gear bag into the passenger seat. Julian's living room doesn't scare me. Evelyn went quiet for a second. Arthur said you'd give me exactly that answer. I hung up and drove past the sprawling Vance estate on my way home. The heavy iron gates were chained open. The massive oak trees Arthur had planted 50 years ago cast long, heavy shadows across the manicured driveway. It was Julian's house now. I'd been banned from crossing that threshold for over a decade. But on Saturday afternoon, I was going to walk right through the front door, and nobody was going to call security. Saturday arrived with a suffocating, humid heat. I pulled my Jeep onto the circular driveway right at 2 o'clock. The exterior of the estate was immaculate, but inside, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. 10 people were crammed into the formal living room. Julian had claimed Arthur's worn leather armchair by the fireplace, practically holding court. Silas leaned against the marble mantel, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal glass, his suit jacket unbuttoned. His wife Chloe sat rigidly on the velvet loveseat, nervously scrolling through her phone. Miriam was aggressively organizing silver tea trays on the credenza, orchestrating a bizarre illusion of high society normalcy while the family foundation cracked beneath her feet. Aunt Clara sat near the hallway, quietly observing. I could read the arrogant certainty in Silas's posture. He fully expected me to walk in, see the gathered firing squad, and surrender. Julian leaned over and whispered something to Miriam. I stepped through the arched doorway entirely alone. No Evelyn, no Elias. Just me, wearing my work boots, carrying a manila folder under my arm, and a black flash drive heavy in my pocket. Silas straightened up, the smug smile stretching across his face. No attorney to hold your hand today? I don't need a lawyer to handle my own family, I said. I dropped the heavy manila folder directly onto the glass coffee table. I didn't sit down. Standing is a tactical choice. You control the room's gravity from your feet. Julian immediately went on the offensive. Before you try to negotiate, we've already retained Sterling and Croft's litigation wing. The paperwork is filed. We are challenging the trust on the grounds of diminished mental capacity. He delivered the words like a judge handing down a life sentence. I just nodded. I know.
and I drove over here to stop you from making the most humiliating mistake of your lives." Silas's smile fractured, just a fraction. I opened the folder and placed 2 separate stacks of paper on the glass. "This is the operating agreement for Vanguard Capital Trust, filed a decade ago. Arthur Vance, founder. Elowen Vance, sole successor. Notarized and ironclad." I slid the documents closer to Silas. He refused to touch them. "And these," I continued, "are 2 exhaustive, independent cognitive evaluations, both performed by Dr. Eris Thorne, a board-certified neuropsychologist who has never been on your payroll. One from the year the trust was founded, one from last year. Both state Arthur was sharper than men half his age." I laid them flat on the table. "The trust is a private corporate entity. It bypasses probate entirely. If you drag this to court, you are fighting 2 flawless medical evaluations. Evelyn Cross guarantees your case will be thrown out before lunch." Silas clenched his jaw. Julian's eyes darted frantically between the papers and my face. "He was heavily manipulated," Silas started, his voice rising. "Silas," I said softly. It was the dead, flat tone I used when a junior welder almost severed a gas line. "Stop talking, because what happens next will ruin you." The blood vanished from Silas's face. I reached into my jacket, pulled out the black flash drive, and set it next to the medical records.
"You have exactly 1 chance," I said, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. "Drop the injunction before I plug this into a computer." Silas stared at the small plastic drive like it was a live grenade sitting on the glass. "What is that?" he asked. His voice had lost all its polished boardroom texture. It sounded thin, desperate. 3 years of Vance Analytics expense reports, I answered. Arthur personally flagged every single discrepancy. Phantom vendor payouts, luxury travel claims for trips you never took, retainers paid out to shell companies that don't exist. $390,000, Silas. Arthur tracked every stolen dime. The room didn't gasp. It simply stopped breathing. Julian slowly turned his head to look at his golden boy. "You stole from the firm?" Julian asked. His voice cracked, hitting a raw, vulnerable register I had never heard in my entire life. 30 years of corporate armor shattered in 5 seconds. Chloe closed her eyes, her knuckles turning white as she gripped her phone. "I could hand this straight to the district attorney," I told them. "Corporate embezzlement from your own family firm carries mandatory prison time. But I'm not calling the cops, because Arthur specifically asked me not to." I let them sweat in the quiet room. "Here are my terms. Silas drops the legal challenge today. He resigns as VP of Vance Analytics immediately. And he repays the $390,000 in full. Installment plans are fine. Nobody goes to court. Nobody goes to prison. We resolve this quietly, internally, just like Silas wanted." Silas didn't argue. He slowly collapsed onto the armrest of the love seat, his legs completely giving out. His tailored suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big. From the hallway, Aunt Clara spoke up, her voice crystal clear. "Arthur told me last summer that Elowen was the only person who never took a single thing from him, yet still showed up every month. I finally understand what he meant."
Julian stared blankly at Silas, then slowly looked up at me. The man who had ruthlessly dictated the terms of this family for 3 decades suddenly had no script. He stood up, looking incredibly old. "My father chose you?" Julian whispered, the words sounding like ash in his mouth. "He chose you over me? Over Silas?" "He didn't choose me over anyone," I corrected him. "He chose me because I was the only person who knocked on his door without holding an invoice. I drank bitter coffee with him every single month for 14 years. I never asked to be put in the will. I just showed up. That's how he knew I was the only one who could actually protect what he built." Julian lowered his head. For a man who had demanded total obedience his entire life, this was an earthquake. "I need time," he muttered. "You've had 14 years, I said, zipping up my jacket. Vanguard Capital is mine. That is a documented legal finality. If anyone wants to read the evaluations, Evelyn Cross has copies. If anyone actually wants to talk to me, really talk, you know where I live." I picked up my manila folder but left the black flash drive resting on the glass table. Silas couldn't take his eyes off it. I turned and walked out the front door. Nobody tried to stop me. Aunt Clara was waiting on the porch. She pulled me into a fierce, silent hug, the exact kind Arthur used to give. Monday morning, I walked into the Vanguard Capital office. It wasn't a skyscraper penthouse. It was a modest, unmarked brick building near the riverfront. 3 full-time employees were sitting around a cheap folding table in the break room. Elias introduced me. There was Helen, the brilliant bookkeeper who knew every tax loophole, Marcus, the commercial property manager, and David, the aggressive land acquisition scout. They had been keeping the $50 million empire running on autopilot for months, waiting for Arthur's successor to arrive.
"I don't know how to manage a corporate hedge fund," I told them bluntly, pulling up a cheap plastic chair. "But I know how to pour a foundation, I know how to run a crew, and I know how to identify rot before it collapses a roof. I need an interim CFO to audit the ledgers, and I need you 3 to keep doing exactly what Arthur trusted you to do." Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. "And what exactly will you be doing?" I learned fast. I'll make the hard calls Arthur used to make, and I'm keeping my own contracting business running. I don't abandon my crew just because I inherited a bigger ship. Helen actually smiled. A real, genuine smile. 2 weeks passed. I was reviewing blueprints when Silas finally called. His voice was completely hollowed out. No arrogance, no negotiation tactics, just a defeated man. "I dropped the challenge," he said quietly. "Evelyn's paperwork was bulletproof. I'm resigning from the firm tomorrow. Chloe made full transparency a condition of staying with me. We mapped out a repayment schedule. When the final check clears, I'll smash the drive," I told him. "Arthur knew everything, Silas. He chose not to destroy you." Silas was quiet for a long time. "I'm sorry about the homeless shelter joke. I don't want an apology. Just pay what you stole and treat your wife better. Don't waste her." Julian never called. He retreated into the massive, empty estate, completely incapable of admitting defeat. I stopped waiting for his name to light up my phone. You can leave a door unlocked for someone without standing in the doorway waiting. That's just basic self-respect. By Friday, Elias brought me a list of names. 4 veteran project managers Silas had viciously fired 3 years ago to cut costs. I hired every single one of them back. I bought a massive reclaimed oak table for the office, the same wood Arthur used to carve. We gathered around it on Friday afternoon, 7 people holding chipped coffee mugs. We didn't do a corporate toast. We clinked our mugs like a demolition crew finishing a brutal shift, drank our terrible coffee, and got to work. Arthur would have loved it. 3 months passed. The ledgers never lied, even when the family did. Silas had officially resigned from Vance Analytics. The board panicked and brought in an aggressive outside CEO from Chicago. The company stabilized, but the explosive growth Silas had always promised vanished entirely. His inherited shares were bleeding value.
He had burned through $40,000 in legal retainers for an injunction that Evelyn Cross crushed before it even reached a judge. And the first monthly installment of his repayment, $32,000, was automatically wired into the Vanguard Trust. Chloe, his wife, had forced him to set up the direct transfer. She filed ironclad postnuptial paperwork that exact same week. Silas was allegedly in intensive therapy. Julian, meanwhile, had incinerated nearly $100,000 on boutique legal consultations before a senior partner finally told him what Evelyn had said on day one. There was absolutely nothing to litigate. The massive Vance estate cost over $20,000 a month just in maintenance, property taxes, and staff. His inherited $2 million was a rapidly ticking clock. Miriam shocked everyone by taking a job as a receptionist at an architectural firm downtown. It was an entry-level desk job, her first actual paycheck in 2 decades. She told Aunt Clara it was utterly terrifying and weirdly exhilarating. At Vanguard Capital, our development slate was running flawlessly. The interim CFO I hired, a ruthless woman named Brenda who spent 20 years dismantling corrupt hedge funds, finished her initial audit. She dropped the heavy binder on my reclaimed oak desk and said exactly what Elias had been saying. Arthur built an absolute fortress. The financial foundation was bedrock. I was taking night classes in advanced corporate operations. I wasn't getting an MBA. I was building a practical toolkit for someone who knew how to weld a steel joint, but was still learning how to navigate corporate acquisitions. But every Saturday morning, I was still on a contracting site by dawn. Steel-toed boots, heavy canvas jacket, and a tape measure clipped to my belt. The Vanguard staff called me director. My demolition crew just called me L.
4 months after the reading, Miriam texted me. She asked to meet at a generic diner halfway between my district and the estate. Neutral territory. She showed up wearing practical flats instead of designer heels, and the only jewelry she had on was her wedding band. She ordered a black drip coffee, which was shocking. She used to order complicated lattes and send them back twice. "I owe you an honest conversation," she said, wrapping her manicured hands around the cheap ceramic mug. "I'm not looking for absolution. I just want to tell the truth." I stayed quiet and let her speak. "I knew exactly what Julian was doing when he exiled you. I watched him do it. I told myself it was between a father and daughter, that stepping in wasn't my place." She looked down at the dark coffee. "The ugly truth is, every time Julian pushed you further away, my share of the safety net grew. I didn't orchestrate it, but I certainly didn't try to stop it." "No," I said flatly. "You didn't." "I'm working now," she said. There was no self-pity in her tone, just statement of fact. "Filing blueprints and answering phones. It's hard." She paused, taking a slow sip. "Julian hasn't left the property in 4 weeks. He just sits in Arthur's old library all day. He barely eats. He doesn't speak. I don't know how to pull him out of it." "I can't save him, Miriam," I told her. "He has to actually want the help." "I know," she whispered. She hesitated, looking incredibly nervous. If I ever need a professional reference for another firm, would you consider writing one?" The question caught me off guard, not because she asked, but because it took genuine courage to ask me, of all people. "Yes," I said, not because I had suddenly forgotten 14 years of silence, but because I actively refused to become the vindictive monster this family had tried to turn me into. She nodded, left a $10 bill on the table, and walked out into the rain.
5 months in, I officially greenlit my first solo project under Vanguard's authority. We called it Arthur's Block. 40 units of high-quality, subsidized housing built directly above community commercial spaces. The acreage was already sitting in the Vanguard portfolio. Arthur had quietly purchased the empty lot back in 2016. When Elias handed me the original deed, there was a sticky note attached in Arthur's scrawl. "This is the neighborhood where I laid my first bricks. Build something people can actually afford to live in." I was standing in the center of the muddy lot at 6 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. I had my hard hat on, blueprints tucked under my arm, shivering in the damp air. Marcus, my property manager, walked the perimeter with me, pointing out the drainage slopes and the optimal angles for solar exposure. "Arthur tried to push this exact blueprint 5 years ago," Marcus said, his breath pluming in the cold. "Silas killed it in committee. He said the profit margins were too thin." "Well, Silas isn't on the committee anymore," I said, pulling a can of neon orange spray paint from my tool belt. "Let's break ground." We spent 2 hours walking the massive lot. I personally marked the exact positions for the primary foundation trenches, just like Arthur had taught me when I was 16. You build from the dirt up, El. Get the foundation right, and the rest of the house will hold. Elias pulled up in his battered truck just as the sun broke over the skyline. He stood at the edge of the lot, arms crossed, watching me spray the final marker. "Arthur swore you'd build a better empire than he ever did," Elias called out. I'm starting to think the old man was right. I looked out across the industrial skyline. A mile east was my tiny apartment. A mile south was my contracting garage. This was the city that had sheltered me when my own blood had locked me out. My grandfather had built a corporate monolith. I was going to build a neighborhood. But both required the exact same thing: standing in the freezing mud at dawn, refusing to quit, and deciding exactly where the walls were going to go.
6 months passed. Julian hadn't called. He hadn't texted. He hadn't sent a single message through Clara or Miriam. Clara told me he was still barricaded inside the estate. He went out for groceries on quiet Tuesday mornings, completely stopped attending his high society galas, and spent 12 hours a day sitting in Arthur's massive library. That was the room Arthur had used as his war room, filled with decaying architectural drafts, leather-bound ledgers, and a heavy brass lamp he never replaced. Clara said Julian never touched a single paper in that room. He just sat in Arthur's wingback chair and stared at the heavy mahogany bookshelves where Arthur kept his personal journals. I think I finally understood what was happening. Julian wasn't grieving the loss of his father. He was violently grieving the death of his own ego. He was mourning the version of himself that could have been a decent man, the version that could have looked at his daughter and said, "I'm proud of you," instead of standing in front of a crowd and declaring, "You are nothing to me." He was sitting in a room filled with the physical evidence of Arthur's life, and hidden inside those journals, he was being forced to read the undeniable proof that Arthur had fiercely loved me the entire time Julian was trying to destroy me. For a man obsessed with absolute control, there is nothing more devastating than realizing your control was an illusion. I drove past the estate late one night. The warm yellow glow of the library window cut through the dark trees. I slowed my Jeep to a crawl. For one brief second, I thought about turning into the driveway. I thought about marching up to the heavy oak doors, knocking, and offering some kind of olive branch to bridge the massive crater between us. I didn't turn the wheel. I kept driving. I had learned a brutal lesson pulling people out of collapsed buildings overseas. You cannot rescue someone who actively refuses to reach for the rope. You can leave the door wide open. You can make absolutely sure they know your coordinates. But you cannot drag a grown man out of a prison he built for himself. Julian knew exactly where to find me. The door was unlocked. I hit the gas and drove back toward the city. Back toward the wet concrete curing at Arthur's Block.
1 year later, Thanksgiving. I didn't host it at a fancy restaurant, and I definitely didn't host it at the Vance estate. I held it right in the middle of my contracting garage. We shoved the heavy welding tables against the brick walls and built a massive 30-foot dining table out of scrap lumber from the Arthur's Block site. It was rough-hewn oak, sanded just enough to prevent splinters, and stained a deep, rich walnut, exactly the finish Arthur used to love. We strung cheap industrial work lights across the steel ceiling beams. I cranked the space heaters on high. We used mismatched folding chairs, paper plates, and plastic cups. It was a compromise I was perfectly happy with. The guest list was 13 people: Elias, Helen, Marcus, David, my entire demolition crew, and Aunt Clara, who showed up carrying 2 massive pecan pies and a bottle of top-shelf whiskey. Not a single person at that table, aside from Clara, shared my last name. Every single one of them had actively chosen to be there. We were halfway through dinner when a sleek, dark sedan pulled up to the open garage bay. It wasn't a car I recognized. The driver's door opened, and Silas stepped out into the cold night air. He was completely alone. He was holding a bottle of expensive red wine, hovering at the edge of the light like a stray dog, unsure if it was going to be kicked. "I don't know if I'm actually welcome here," he said, his voice stripped of all his usual arrogance. "You're standing in my garage," I said, grabbing a spare folding chair. "Come sit down." Silas sat down right between Elias and Marcus, 2 men he had aggressively fired to boost his quarterly margins 3 years ago. Nobody brought it up. Marcus shoved a paper plate full of turkey toward him. Elias poured him a plastic cup of whiskey. "You know how to run a plasma cutter?" Elias asked him gruffly. "No," Silas admitted, looking terrified. "Then you're on garbage duty tonight," Elias grunted. The entire table erupted in laughter. It was loud, chaotic, and entirely real. It was the sound of people who worked for a living and didn't need to perform for an audience. Julian never showed up. Nobody brought that up either. After the last guest left and the garage was finally quiet, I drove my Jeep out to the Vance estate. I didn't go to the main house. I walked around the back, toward the old carriage house Arthur had converted into his private workshop. The heavy iron padlock was gone. Julian never went out there. It belonged to Arthur. It always would. I pulled the heavy chain on the overhead lamp. A single warm yellow bulb flickered to life, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room smelled exactly like him: sharp cedar, raw linseed oil, and stale black coffee. The pegboards were covered in perfectly aligned hand tools. In the center of the room sat his massive maple workbench. The wood was worn incredibly smooth right at the edge, polished by 40 years of Arthur leaning against it. I sat down on his freezing metal stool. I didn't tell this story to brag about inheriting $58 million. That money isn't a trophy. It's a terrifying responsibility. It's the payroll for 17 people and the concrete foundation for 40 families. I would gladly trade every single penny just to have Arthur sitting on this stool next to me, showing me how to properly sharpen a chisel. But he left me something vastly more valuable than a corporate trust fund. He left me undeniable proof that someone believed in my worth when my own father decided I was garbage. 62 handwritten letters. That was my actual inheritance. If you are sitting somewhere reading this, and the people who are supposed to protect you have decided you aren't enough, I can't promise you a magical phone call from a lawyer, but I will tell you exactly what Arthur taught me. Do not waste your life begging for a seat at their table. Build your own damn table. The lumber is sitting right in front of you. Pick up the hammer.
So here is the absolute reality of where I stand today. After the explosive will reading, the speakerphone drop, and a full year of deafening silence from Julian, I operate my life by 3 unbroken rules. I write them on a piece of scrap drywall and nailed it right next to Arthur's photograph in my office. Rule 1. I do not ask for permission to take up space. If they don't invite me, I kick the door open. If they refuse to offer me a chair, I control the room from my feet. My existence is not up for negotiation. Rule 2. I refuse to let anyone weaponize my past against me. The deployments, the grime, the years I spent being treated like a ghost, that past forged my spine. Every single collapsed roof I reinforced prepared me to carry the weight of this empire. Rule 3. I leave the door unlocked, but I will never, ever chase someone through it. Julian knows my address. If he ever decides to walk through my door, I will be sitting right here. But I am absolutely done waiting at the threshold. Waiting is a victim's game. Patience is a tactician's strategy. There is a massive difference. Arthur didn't just leave me a fortune, he left me a fortress.
a garage full of tools, and the unshakable certainty that one person saw my calloused hands and knew I was worth betting the entire house on. The millions are just the tools. That fierce, uncompromising belief is the real inheritance. I placed my palm flat against the smooth edge of the maple workbench. My hand fit perfectly into the shallow groove Arthur had worn into the wood over 10,000 days of labor. "Thanks, old man," I whispered to the empty room. I pulled the chain, plunging the workshop back into darkness. I slid the heavy wooden door shut and walked across the gravel to my Jeep. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life in the quiet night. My hands gripped the steering wheel, completely steady. I put it in gear and drove back toward the city, where the foundation of Arthur's block was setting hard in the freezing air, and 17 people were waiting for my orders on Monday morning.